find a seat. There's still a lot of seats up front. All right, so I would like to welcome everybody to Conversations in the Disciplines. If you're here for a RIT 1133 course, you've been learning about different forms of research, qualitative and quantitative and text-based interpretive, and doing some projects. And we're really happy today to have three wonderful presenters to talk about their research and to make some of those traditions come alive. So Professor Bacon is in marketing and does work about student testing and assessment, as well as being a consultant for how to do survey-based methods. Alejandro Cerrón in anthropology is involved in medical anthropology and epidemiology in Guatemala, and he'll be talking about his qualitative methods and field work. And Susan Schulten in history has done a lot of work with cartography, history of maps, and 19th century American history. So we'll start by short presentations from all three professors, and then you'll have the chance to ask questions. We're going to start with Professor Schulten. Maps is close to the past, so I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, and I'd be incredibly flattered to see an audience like this, but I have a feeling that you have certain kinds of incentives and pressures to be here, so I won't take it as a compliment. My name is Susan Schulten. I'm a historian. I'm chair of the history department here. I've been here since 1996, which means I'm one of the old timers in the department. And I'll be rather naked about my goal here tonight, which is not just to tell you about the kind of work I do, but to give you a taste and hopefully tempt you into taking some of our courses and being one of the many, many minors and the many majors. We have a great major here on campus. So the first thing I want to say is by way of empathy. If you're feeling pain in your first year writing sequence, I want to also tell you that I'm going through something of the same thing. About 5 years ago, I started doing for the first time some short form writing. Historians generally speak, at least scholarly historians do, their primary audience is other historians. So most of my career has been writing books and long, long articles with many, many footnotes. But about 5 years ago, I got a call from an editor at the Times, and they were about to launch a series that would follow the Civil War day by day, 150 years later. We've probably been inundated with the sesquicentennial. It's not just DU's sesquicentennial, it's the Civil War. And he asked if I would be someone who would contribute articles, particularly looking at the geography and the cartography of that war. And I was a little nervous about it, but I said yes. And in that experience, first writing for the Times, and then more recently I've written a series for the New Republic. I've also written for The Economist and for other outlets. I've been able to reach a wider audience, but I have to tell you, and the reason I empathize if you're feeling pain, is that the learning curve has been incredibly steep. Going from writing at a very slow pace, a very deliberative and reflective pace, to a very quick and on deadline, and can it be less than 1,000 words, if not less than 500 words. That's been very, very difficult. Over and over, the editor would take my thesis statement, which was at the very bottom, as I was taught. You take readers along and then you make a conclusion. He would immediately rip it out and put it up front. He would change words, he would change titles. Everything was sort of up for grabs as I began to learn how to write for a very different audience. I'm certainly not a master in it today, but I wanted to just show you these are the kind of things I've been interested in. This one on the left was one I did, one of about 20 I did for the Times. An issue that's particularly of interest to my students who take the Civil War, the question of civil liberties. As you may know, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus many times over the course of the Civil War. More recently, I wrote one based on a discovery I made of some maps in the National Archives that were particularly made with data written on them so that Sherman could find his way from Atlanta, where he cut loose from his supply line, and march his way to Savannah. These were revolutionary breakthroughs in map making, and the article I try to make, or the argument I try to make here, this is sort of the intellectual foundation for what we now know as GIS, where maps compile data. So that's one of the challenges, and if you'd like, we can talk more about what short form writing entails. What I wanted to show you today was something that happened to me last week when I was in the Library of Congress. Ready from the start? Yes. And it gets to this issue about what you can do and the kind of questions you can ask with non-traditional types of sources. As Camilla said, one thing I'm really interested in are old maps. What can old maps tell us about the past? Somebody I wrote about a long time ago has recently re-entered my life. He's a man who was an artist by trade in the Great Depression, an out-of-work artist, by the way, who stumbled into the offices of Time and then Time's sister publication, Fortune, where his life utterly changed, and where in turn he utterly changed the story of map making in the United States. And to understand that, you need to understand how most Americans looked at the world prior to World War II. This is a fairly conventional map. It's what we call a Mercator projection. Most of you have probably heard that term. It's a projection that was invented in the 16th century for the purposes of navigation, because directionally it makes perfect sense. But as you probably well know, because you're weaned on this, it vastly exaggerates the northern and the southern latitudes, because what you've done is to take a globe and to peel it and to stretch it onto a two-dimensional plane. So this is the kind of map that most Americans would have been familiar with. It's the kind of map that children would have been reared on in geography classes. It's the kind of map that you would have seen in any atlas produced in Europe or the United States from about 1900 until about 1940. Here's another example, just to give you a sense of how sort of rigid or conventional or in place this idea was. Everything changes with the advent of World War II. And that's one of the many ways that, for me, the story of the history of cartography in this country is largely driven by crisis, in the Civil War especially, and to a lesser extent in World War II. And I want to show you how that artist transformed the map. Part of what you have to understand is the advent of aviation in the early 20th century. What the advent of aviation did was to collapse the very concept of distance. It was to collapse the distance across oceans, and more importantly, across the poles, most importantly, the North Pole. And so what Harrison did when he stumbled into that new position is he began to think about how we might redraw the world map to reflect the fact that aviation now dominated the concept of distance. And let me show you what I mean by that. When he came into the offices of Time and then Fortune, he was, like I said, someone who had been weaned on art and design. Those concepts of art and design for him governed the way he thought about geography, particularly taking what he believed we lacked, which was a global perspective. The height of his celebrity came in the middle of the war, when all the maps that he had published for Time and Fortune were gathered together in a single publication that didn't even hit the shelves. It sold out completely before it even was distributed to booksellers around the United States. Richard Eads Harrison became a household name during the Second World War, and I'll show you why. The first thing he did was to get rid of that Mercator projection. He said it makes no sense. It makes no sense in the age of aviation, and it particularly makes no sense when distance has been collapsed and when a war that's being fought is being fought almost entirely in the Northern Hemisphere. Think about it. The war that begins in 1939 for the Europeans and for the Americans in December of 1941, all of it is entirely fought in the Northern Hemisphere. Almost all of it, right? And so he said there's no reason to even use the Mercator projection. Let's put the North Pole at the center and see what happens. And so he begins to draw projections like this, which show Americans what the pole is like. You may think these look mundane and ordinary. Americans had never seen a projection like this. They wouldn't even have known at first what they were looking at, which explains why many of his maps have dense text to try to explain to Americans what they're looking at. Here's one where he takes a slightly different projection, one that would drive cartographers crazy, because you see that the southern hemispheres are stretched beyond recognition. His point again, though, is it doesn't really matter. Airline distances are accurate, both directionally and in terms of distance. And so he wants to force us out of what he called this long cartographic slumber and shock Americans and Europeans as well into rethinking the very concept of distance, right? He said this is what Americans need when they have to understand why Roosevelt sends troops to the Mediterranean or Greenland. Most Americans don't understand that logic, given what they were reared on. You can see he starts to educate Americans in the very concept of projection, that every map lies, is the way he puts it. Every map is a distortion. You just need to account for that distortion and pick the one that works the best for you. You can see a close-up here in the way he's trying to focus on primarily airline distances in a war that really had become a war of aviation. But the maps that Harrison was most known for were the ones that used his artistic perspective, where he would stare at a globe for long periods of time, a massive globe. I've seen the one he actually used. And then begin to photograph it. And then from those photographs, begin to sketch perspective so that Americans could sort of apprehend the concept of distance and terrain from the air. Traditionally trained cartographers hated these maps. He said they're not maps at all, they're pictures, they're propaganda. But Harrison pushed back and said that's exactly what we need right now, is to give Americans a sense of orientation and direction, and especially to get them out of this sense that north should always be at the top. And so these are the kind of ways he tried to pull Americans in. 8 views of the world, you can see. You can see how he plays with distance and orientation. And then I can show you some of the ones he's most known for. To us, when I show people these maps, the first thing they usually say is the way it anticipates Google Earth, right? And this is half a century before such a thing. Here he's trying to show us the incredibly complex terrain in China, the very forbidding war that's ahead of us there, if that becomes a mainland war beyond Japan. You can see all the ways in which he tries to depict terrain and to give a kind of terrestrial feel. Now, this is an impossible angle, right? There is no such viewpoint as this. But what he's trying to do is to convey a sense of sort of what it might look like hovering over the landscape. And you can see the way he's mixed both his artistic impressions, but he's also played with scale, right? There is no imaginary viewpoint that this approximates. But we actually understand it. It gives us a sense of obstacles of geography in a way that a traditional two-dimensional map does not. Here's one of the most well-known maps that he does for soldiers. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about Harrison tonight is that if you go upstairs, there's a new exhibit of pictorial maps that we put up last week. As you go up the staircase right here, one of the first that you'll see right in front of you is Harrison's news map of Japan. And it's the kind of maps that were first published for the public in Fortune and then repackaged and sent overseas for all the soldiers to give them as well a sense of how the geography of the war might unfold. You can see again the way he brings you into the terrain, invites you with very, very seductive color, right? Again, to give a sense of the complexity, in this case, around Tokyo. You can see the level of detail is really astonishing. This one I particularly like because the Mercator projection gives you a sense of the vastness of the Pacific, but here he's really trying to bring it home, that that's what the Pacific War is. It is water, right? That it's not just a hop, skip, and a jump between Alaska and Japan, right? That there is this vast distance, particularly closer to the equator, that means this is going to be a long naval war, which indeed it was, the last part of the war to be won. Again, this other perspective that I almost want to send this map to Sarah Palin because I feel like it vindicates what she was trying to say. I can see that she's trying to convey that Americans don't think about proximity around the pole in this regard. Here's another one because Americans were not quite understanding the field of battle and the importance of the theater of North Africa and the centrality of the Mediterranean, right? Why Italy in particular was so crucial in that first phase of war. You can see why these struck a chord with Americans. It gave them an original, an artistic, and a very easily accessible way to think about the geography of the war. I've got a couple more here, but I want to stay on time. I wanted to show you this one because there are important implications for the way Harrison conceived of the war. He conceived it very much as an international. He was constantly pushing the Americans closer to intervention. If you know your American history, you know how hard Roosevelt worked to convince Congress and the American people first to accept Lend-Lease, and more importantly, to ally openly with the British and then commit ourselves to the war. And when did we finally do that? Only when attacked. That's how long it took. So Harrison was constantly, as early as 37 and 38, pushing the Americans closer to fight against fascism. But in the post-war period, Harrison's viewpoints have a very different connotation. And you will see that they spread very, very quickly into a kind of Cold War mentality. So here you have that Europe from Moscow viewpoint that was precisely the one he crafted to talk about allies during the war to a very different end, to the Cold War, right? Once the Soviet Union has turned and the Cold War has begun by about 45 or 46. Now, the reason I wanted to show all of this to you is that one of the big questions for me in using maps is how did the map get made? And more importantly, how did the map get used? Maps are tricky. They're a little bit like artwork. It's not always clear and easily understood how these things get produced and how they get received. They're partial pieces of evidence. But last week when I was in the Library of Congress, I was lucky enough to look at the Harrison collection, which has now all been collected and organized, not in the way that it was when I worked on it 18 years ago. Now it's very easily accessible, and I have both of those types of evidence. So Harrison kept meticulous records. He had an enormous ego, and that, for historians, bears tremendous fruit because he recorded every letter he got, every compliment, every criticism, and very, very careful records of every map he made. So Irwin Royce is the name at the bottom here. You don't need to read this, but there were dozens and dozens of letters from Royce and hundreds of letters from other professional cartographers talking to Harrison about his work, all through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So there's tremendous evidence that we don't always have of how these maps get received, how they're understood, how they're used. He kept every piece of fan mail he got, from children who were doing school reports to people who said, "You changed the way I've understood geography after 8 years." So those are sort of interesting pieces of evidence that I want to begin to use, and you can start to think about how dimensionality comes into this, right? The map is one piece of evidence, but there's got to be evidence around a map to make the story more complete. And then finally, I want to show you the thing that really is, to me, the kind of mother lode, but I'm not sure how to use it. This is one of his most famous maps, published in July of 1941, right just a few months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. When the United States has certainly committed to Lend-Lease, the Congress has made it clear that it's going no further than that. That's the commitment that they're willing to make. And so Harrison publishes a map in Fortune, making very clear that if the Soviet Union falls, and it's about to fall, this is right at the moment of Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans turn on the Russians, break that Nazi-Soviet pact, and invade the Soviet Union. So what Harrison's trying to convey here is, this is likely the enemy that we're going to be dealing with. Germany plus Soviet Union equals enormous Axis enemy. And he shows you the other outliers and the way that the alliances will fall together or apart. I think I have that. Yes, you can go a little closer here. Everything from anti-Axis potentially anti-axis, waiting to pick a winner, you know, the lily-livered neutrals, as he put it, definitely pro-axis and axis, right? Like I said, this guy is deeply internationalist. So the map is very clearly propaganda in its persuasion. That's not anything he's trying to hide. But what I was able to find in LC last week were drafts that he used to make the map. I forgot that I had this, so you can see. You can see him showing his hand here. The neutrals waiting to pick a winner, potentially disruptive elements within the axis, etc. The situation as of July 7th, and is subject to change without notice. He had a terrific sense of humor using his advertising sensibility. So here's the map that as it's published. Here are the first two drafts of the map. And I just do this, I have no idea what to do with these things. And so I wanted to show you a real mystery and real partial kind of problem that historians deal with. Here's his first draft, where you can see he says title and such. I think I have title and such, the choosing of sides, blah, 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 he says. And then you can begin to see how he's putting the story together. The red lines are the flow of Lend-Lease money. So he's trying to begin to show kind of in an infographic way, how can I show Americans how high the stakes are here? They couldn't be higher, in his opinion, right? He starts to think about, okay, here we can line up the score of what the Axis enemies have conquered and win. Here's the second draft, where he's beginning to fill in a little bit more the countries, the kind of information he wants to show. And then I can zero in on to give you a sense, the map as published, title and such, the choosing of sides is incomplete, the flow of Lend-Lease. And he's trying to think about the categories that he'll use to organize the map and to, more importantly, persuade his readers. Here he's beginning to narrate that. Here's the second draft, right, where he's beginning, you can see, to develop color and association and trying to think about a range in the legend. And here's finally the published one. I think that might be, whoop, that's something. So to wrap up, I just wanted to give you a sense of how attractive and seductive maps can be. The perils of working with maps is that, like I said, they're always partial. To me, the payoff is tremendous because they're a form of communication and a form of knowledge that forces particularly historians to use a different part of their brain. Historians like texts. We like documents. It's the kind of thing we're used to working with. But for me, the last 10 or 15 years working with maps has opened up an entirely new sort of window onto the past. Thank you.
Czech cartographer, and I never knew very much about American maps, so this was fascinating to me. Professor Bacon will speak next about his quantitative research in marketing and
While following a map expert, my graphics are going to look so sad. This is hard. Okay, I'm going to talk a little about research in marketing education, and that's kind of an odd thing. So he's a marketing professor, why is he talking about education? But within marketing, one of my special areas has become education. So maybe I'll show this slide and try to illustrate that. So we've got the little red circle at the bottom, maybe that's marketing content. And then we've got a big blue circle, probably the education area is bigger than marketing. There's more stuff written and more studies done and more cool things done. And then quantitative methods, that's probably bigger than marketing, but I don't know how big that is. And where I do research is typically in that intersection. And I think it's interesting to think about, because my hunch is in history and in anthropology and other areas, you've got people in those areas who also have quantitative skills or have qualitative skills or have combinations of skills. So it's not like if you pick one area, you selected your methodology. I think within those areas, is that true? Yeah, within those areas, if you were quantitative or qualitative, whatever, there's still interesting questions that could be addressed by different methods. Certainly within marketing, there are some anthropological methods in marketing, some text-based methods and other kinds of things. My interest happens to be the quantitative stuff, for unknown reasons, I guess. And a little background on that, on how I came to that. I was always pretty good at math, but I never, people would say, oh, you should study math. It's like, no, it doesn't really interest me that much. I'm good at it, but it's not really a passion of mine. There are other questions that I was more interested in. And as my career progressed, I realized, math is an interesting way to answer those questions. So I kind of came back to math, and I kind of enjoy that. Not that I pursued it because I love math, but I pursued it because I love these other questions, and I could gain interesting insights by using a little bit of math, little statistics. Another thing that happened to me in my professional journey was that when I started teaching at DU, I had the good fortune of having some great students and getting along well with my classes, and I got pretty good course evaluations. You've all probably done course evaluations, so I mentioned that term, you know what I'm talking about. Right. And people said, wow, you're a wonderful teacher. And I thought, is course evaluations all there is to being a wonderful teacher? Is that the only measure? Like if you get a 5.5, ta-da, you are an expert. It's like, wow, because I was getting good scores my first year here, and I had decades more to go. So what do I do for the rest of the future decades? So it occurred to me that maybe I should also think about what my students are learning. So maybe we could measure what they're learning, and because maybe that's not exactly the same thing as how well I do on the course evaluations. And so there might be two measures. And so as soon as you start thinking about measures and how would you know, this is tapping into stuff that I am interested in, like how would you measure that? How would you know? How could you put a number on that? How would you come up with a valid number? So that leads to things like how could you put numbers on cognitive states, like how much people know? You can't cut open their heads and look for, do they know all the concepts or something? So you have to ask them questions, and then you have to wonder, am I asking the right questions? Are those valid questions? Certainly there's a lot of psychology involved with that, in terms of how people store memories and things like that. But there's also a lot of math involved with that, a lot of metrics. So the subfield there is, that I always have liked the name, psychometrics. How do you measure these psychological things? So psychometrics is an entire field of study that some people in education, some people in marketing, some people in psychology like to think about psychometrics. How do you measure these things? So as I started off on my journey to think about how would I know if my students have learned anything, I had to think about, could I give them a test? Is a test an okay way to learn those things? And then, of course, you have to wonder what kind of test would that be? So can I use a multiple choice test, or are those like totally invalid? Because people could guess, and that would be wrong then. Or could I use essay tests? And it turns out this whole area of what type of tests, extensively studied. Tons of books in these areas, interesting stuff. With multiple choice tests, people could guess, and so you've got some error in your measurement. With essay tests, they could bluff. It's like their technical term. They could like make up stuff. Oh yeah, and you just get eloquent, and you think, oh, the teacher will give me partial credit, this will be great. And so it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what they knew from essay tests too. There are other measures, and if I have more time, we can talk about lots of other measures, but so it's interesting to think, how would you know what is the best measure? One way, certainly, you can look at the test itself and think, does that look valid to me? And so face validity, technically, is the term where experts would look at the test and say, we agree those are good questions to measure this type of knowledge you think you want to measure. Beyond that, though, could I put a measure on how good a test is? I would say this test is a 95% test. This test is only a 45% test or something. And there are measures like that, measures of reliability, measures of how well certain tests correlate with other tests. And if they correlate highly, you'd think, well, we're probably on to something. If it doesn't correlate at all, you think, I think they're just guessing. It's just guessing going on. Or it's a completely different concept, completely different construct. So, course evaluations and learning on tests. Turns out that at least in business schools, there is no correlation between what people learn as measured by tests and how they rate teachers as measured by course evaluations. I think there is a small correlation in some other disciplines, but it's pretty small. So those are probably different things. And so if we want to understand quality teaching and education, we probably need to measure both those things. Certainly student satisfaction is very important. I'm not saying we shouldn't use course evaluations. I'm saying it's different than learning. We probably need to look at both of them at the same time. And we can learn those things by taking measures of each, seeing how well they correlate, and thinking, wow, they don't correlate much at all. Even in a whole bunch of different studies, they don't correlate much at all. These are probably different things. Let's come up with a new theory about what course evaluations are and what we're actually measuring when we do that. Then, of course, you could talk about how we measure changes in learning. So when you start a course, do you have like zero knowledge? Or do you have like some knowledge already? You probably have some knowledge already. And so maybe there isn't a concept of, oh, I've increased my learning by 20%. Well, that assumes you had like some zero, we could measure your 0 point of knowledge and see that you're much higher, it's an awkward thing. There are some types of measures, especially psychometric measures, where there is no absolute zero. So everything is relative to something else. So that creates some interesting challenges. When I say absolute zero, does that make sense? Maybe you had a chemistry class or another class where they talk about absolute zero, like nothing can get colder than absolute zero. And if you're twice as warm as absolute zero, then you're twice as warm. But 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees is not twice as warm. Because Fahrenheit, the zero is not an absolute. So different mathematical rules apply. And when we measure psychometric things, we have to be very careful with our mathematical rules to make sure we're measuring things we think are pretty valid. So those bring about a whole series of challenges. One question that I got interested in, and I wanted to talk through a study just to give you a feel for what a study in this area looked like. And a study hopefully that's relevant to y'all in your studies, your education. I was very curious, how much do students remember what they learned in school? Have you ever wondered that? Like 2 weeks after finals, you think, I can't remember anything I learned last week. Like completely erase the tapes somehow. Or is some little bit left? And how long will that little bit last? So you probably remember a lot the day after, a little bit less after, is there some kind of curve, some kind of decay curve? In fact, there is. And so I was wondering for my own classes, so it's not enough just that students give me good evaluations, that's nice. But that they learned a lot, that's nice. How much do they actually retain? How much will they know? If I taught them as sophomores, how much will they retain by the time they graduate? So if it's nothing by the time they graduate, maybe I should rethink my profession, or rethink how I teach or something. So this got me intrigued. So this slide is describing a methodology I use. So I was teaching a course at the sophomore level, and students could take it as juniors, some even took it as seniors, but a lot took it as sophomores. And so I gave a final exam, and I was using multiple choice tests. It was a test with high reliability. If we measure those, I worked on the test to make it a really good test. Gave this test to usually sophomores, and then later on, I'd sneak into the capstone course in marketing, and I'd give them a section of the same exam over again. I think I had a 100-question test on the final, and I gave them 50 questions. I just showed up to class one day. So I'm Professor Bacon, I remember meeting you all. If you could take about half an hour and fill out this test for me, they're like, what? Oh, please. I think I had candy or something off. And they're like, okay, fine, we'll do this. They signed consent forms. We did all those good things. And so then I could look at how much they remembered in the capstone compared to how much they knew as a sophomore. And what was kind of cool, usually the capstone was as a senior. Usually this course was a sophomore, but sometimes it was a junior. And sometimes it was earlier in their senior year. So you actually have several points in time, several different kind of retention intervals, and you could see how much people had forgotten. One cool aspect of the math that got me intrigued was how do we equate the scores? So if they got 80% correct on that 100-question test, and they got 80% correct on the 50-question test, are those exactly the same 80%? Maybe the 50 was a little bit harder, or a little easier. There's some cool math. There's a lot of really smart people who have spent decades thinking about this stuff. And George Roche was one really smart guy who came up with this cool way of equating tests. So I equated tests across all these time intervals, recorded the initial score on the final exam, the ending score on the equivalent final exam, and the retention interval. I knew when I had the students in class, and I knew when I took this other test later. So I accumulated all this data. And then I set about estimating these retention curves using regression analysis. So a statistical technique you could use to plot curves. So here's the curves. It goes down, sadly. I wish it were flat. It's not flat. And a couple interesting things here. You can see it's steep at the beginning and then flattens out. Mathematically, it follows something we call a power curve. It's actually a specific mathematical function that follows. Oddly enough, it's been studied a lot. Oddly enough, same curve occurs in animals. So it's something about how our brains work. You know, they can train pigeons to peck on things in cages, and then they get treats and things, and they change what they have to peck for to get the treats. And they measure them all the time, and they can show the same decay curve as they forget which thing to peck on to get the treat. You can train pigs, and you can get similar curves. So I knew the mathematical curve I wanted. I just needed some measures so I could actually plug in my own data and see exactly how steep or flat or whatever it was with my own data. I plotted in here roughly the A grades, the B grades, and the C grades. Another cool thing I had was some students in that capstone course transferred in or something, or were taking courses out of sequence, and had never had that course that I taught as a sophomore when they were should have as well. So I had a baseline there of, if you had never taken my class, how well could you guess the answers on the test at this point in your career? Now, maybe they've heard those things, some of the concepts in their other marketing classes, so they may not have flunked. It's that line just below 65. They might not have flunked, but they wouldn't have gotten a very good grade. When we see some scores like that 75 dipping below that, and those are weeks across the bottom, so 52 weeks is a year, and 104 is 2 years, 156 is 3 years. 3 years later, those C students know less than the average student who never had my class. It's discouraging. It's a good thing I had tenure. No, I have to get a lot of thought. I don't mean to write that off that easily. But it's something to think. It's something I think about. One of the things I learned in doing the study. Whenever you do a quantitative study, probably any kind of study, you've got a big part of the research called your literature review. So you read all these other papers about how pigeons forget things and how pigs forget things. And I learned that if you study something over time, hopefully you've heard this before, distributed study they call that. So instead of just cramming the night before the exam, if you studied it every week, every few nights, you review some stuff, you actually retain it longer. So I had a method in the study. I think on the final exam, I had some questions that were also on the midterm, or some content. So midterm questions were tested once. Final exam questions, some content was tested twice. So they had to study it twice. That content they remembered longer. So it's not all sad news. I learned some things about how I could help students to retain things longer, really encourage them to study several times. Set up exercises where you have to review the material. Oh, these final exams, comprehensive. So I have to tell this story every quarter and tell them, oh, I'm not trying to beat you up, but a comprehensive final exam, you'll actually retain this stuff longer. I'm actually on your side here. I know it's work, but you'll actually retain it longer. The best predictor of future recall was their score on the exam. It's not like some people get A's on the exam and they forget it faster than other people who, not that much. If you got an A on the exam, you'll probably know better 3 years from now than someone got a C on the exam. The other factors were smaller effects. Another positive news item, I guess, in here is what you think you've forgotten, you can easily recall, more easily learn, I should say, than if you never learned it in the first place. So these things where they got these C's on the test some years later, if I said, okay, let's do a 2-hour review session, I could probably bump them up to a B or something just like that. If they never had the class, I couldn't get a score that high from them. You can relearn it faster. And that's an interesting implication there is there probably is some learning that's still in their head. Their heads are permanently changed in some ways. Our heads are changed when we learn things. I just couldn't get that to show on an exam. But something has changed their head permanently so they can relearn it on the job or in graduate school or whatever, if they needed it again, they could probably relearn it faster. That's what I tell them. That's why they stayed in this job. It's not all sad news, I guess. Okay. I just want to give an overview of kind of how on earth I got into a quantitative area within marketing, and then a feel for the kind of study I've done. I've done several in education on things like team projects, team functioning, things like that. The same kinds of models apply if you're studying customer satisfaction in a restaurant as if you're studying student satisfaction in a classroom. Some of the same measures, some of the same methods, some of the same statistics. So it's very similar that way. So I've helped a lot of consulting clients do measures like that. Fairly similar to the research that I've done. Good. You ready for the next one? Okay. All right. Thank you.
A lot of implications there, both for how we should teach and how we should learn. And Professor Sarah will speak next. So.
All right. All right. So do I have 20 minutes or 15 minutes?
Up to 20.
Up to 20. Okay. All right. So I will try to share with you the way I feel like I'm learning how to write. I started my professional life as a physician in rural Guatemala. Not much writing. But I had all these ideas, and somehow I ended up writing some essays. I guess I don't know, I had good ideas sometimes, and I was able to write them, and some people wanted to read them. So I felt like I knew how to write. Doing work in rural Guatemala in public health, I ended up, I don't know, somehow getting frustrated because I was not doing much to improve health, really. Or maybe motivated to try to work on health stuff from a different perspective. And that's what ended up leading me to studying anthropology. And in one way, I feel like studying anthropology, in one way, was really about learning how to write, and how to read, and how to engage with the written word, and how to see the world in a way as a text. I learned to look at an image and then somehow turn that into writing. And I learned that writing can serve different purposes. But maybe the most important thing that I learned through my studying anthropology is that doing anthropological work, doing ethnographic research, doing qualitative research, and the writing that comes with it is very different from writing an essay or writing a research paper. And that's what I will try to share with you today. So I will try to talk a little bit about what I do as an anthropologist. Well, I teach, right? But I also do research, so I will talk about the research that I do. And then I will talk about the writing. My general guess is that some of you will not know necessarily what anthropology is. So we like to say that anthropology is just the study of what humans do. And we like to say that we compare that across time or across space. There are 4 subdisciplines in anthropology. One of them is sociocultural anthropology. So what I do is really sociocultural anthropology. I do not do archaeology, I do not do linguistics, I do not do physical anthropology. So the kind of thing that you see often in TV shows, forensic anthropologists doing really cool stuff. That's not what I do. Sorry to disappoint you. And what we focus on mainly is in studying cultural similarities and differences. So there are 3 projects I have been involved with that I just wanted to share with you. One was when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork in Guatemala. My dissertation had to do with the right to health. What does it mean? What are different people doing with that idea? But as I was doing that work, I was contacted by a coalition of indigenous rights organizations, and they were suing the Guatemalan state for violating the right to health, the right to food and nutrition of 5 kids who lived in some rural villages in Guatemala, and they were struggling with how could they make the case, especially because they felt like they knew that the judge and basically the whole judicial system was going to think that these kids were undernourished because their parents were irresponsible. So they wanted to show somehow that these parents were not really irresponsible. So that's how they contacted me, and I worked with 2 anthropology students from Guatemala. And we put together a report that was used as part of the evidence that was used in the case. And what we did there was basically trying to show these kids and their families' experiences in context. Trying to show how when they got sick or when they tried to do work or to find a job, there was just a context that was really against them and not allowing them to be successful. So, so the kind of writing that I had to do for that was not the same as the kind of writing that I do when I am trying to write an academic paper. This other project I have been involved with, there is this NGO based out of Guatemala, the Center for Studies on Equity and Governance in Health Systems. What they do is that they try to work with community leaders from rural Guatemala. And basically they have monthly discussions about what the right to health means or should mean, what they should be getting in terms of services. And from there, leaders end up deciding some actions to try to improve health-related stuff in their communities. So some of the things that through this work we are trying to figure out is who are these leaders and how are they engaging in this kind of work, because they don't really get anything really tangible from that. It's just more work, responsibility, having to travel to the capital city. Sometimes they just get in trouble. So we were trying to figure out how does it work? Why do they think that they get involved in this? When did they decide that they wanted to get involved in this? Why? How does that work? And from there we wanted to really figure out what was the best way, how this NGO could help them do what they wanted to do or to achieve what they wanted to achieve for their communities. So the purpose of this project was really getting into these individuals' experiences, how they thought about their history of activism, and the main purpose was for this NGO to use it as part of their activist work. So the kind of stuff that I had to write for that was really a technical report and a simplified version of that report that then was used in these community meetings, monthly meetings with community leaders who for the most part are illiterate or are not, their formal education is very low. So I had to write something very simple that got to the heart of what we found, to use it as part of the discussions and the developments that this NGO was trying to come up with the leaders. We are also now writing an academic paper based on that project. And then this is connected to the work that these community leaders do. They have been, for 8 or 9 years, they have been having these meetings and then trying to figure out what to do. And one of the main problems that they keep finding is that public healthcare facilities lack the essential medicines that they are supposed to have. And they have been trying to work out the administrative processes to figure out if they can just make them more efficient so that they will have the medicines that should be there. But nothing of what they have done has worked. So they keep trying to do it, and the fact is that medicines are still lacking in these public healthcare facilities in rural areas. So they wanted to figure out, okay, so there is a budget for these medicines. There is supposedly a system that should function in a way that these medicines should be there, available, but it's still not working. So why is this not working, and what could we do to make a change? So I'm working with 2 colleagues there, trying to figure out why is this system not working, or what purpose, other than the stated purpose, is the system serving. So it has to do with corruption, the incentives in the wrong place, people not doing their job, politicians trying to do things that they are not supposed to do, pharmaceutical companies trying to do what they are not supposed to do. So lots of those things, right? But what we are trying to figure out is what are the mechanisms so that we can then somehow influence them. So one of the challenges there is that we have been having some difficulties accessing information. People who know what's going on don't want to tell us or don't want to give us the evidence, right? And we have also realized that we may be getting in some sort of trouble by asking these questions, because there are some powerful people whose economic interests may be affected if this stuff changes. But then we are, and I guess because of that, we are also having a hard time trying to write, communicate the cases as coherent cases that we can now use to show decision makers or activists what's going on and maybe what can be done to change it. So we are having some difficulties trying to write those in a coherent way. Okay, now, all this work is based on, basically on ethnographic research. And ethnographic research can use any research techniques. It can use even quantitative methods. But for the most part, ethnographic research will use a combination of individual interviews, group interviews, and participant observation. We can use other stuff, but we definitely, very likely will use combination of interviews and participant observation. And what we are struggling with when we are doing this kind of research is, because we are dealing with highly subjective information, we are dealing with beliefs, perceptions, what people say about their values. We are trying to make the connection between what people say that they think and what they do, and why that doesn't necessarily match out perfectly. So a couple of things that we need to struggle with as we are doing the research and then as we are writing is with our own ethnocentrism, that is judging the others based on my own values. We try to be aware of the possibility of judging the others based on their own values, which we call cultural relativism. And we try to use what we like to call the anthropological approach, which is basically trying to be non-judgmental as a way of understanding why people do what they do, which is not the same as not having your own opinions, but somehow just believing in the possibility of me being able to bracket out my opinions as I am doing my research. So in other words, it would be, I mean, not judging either of these women, not judging by what they are wearing or what they are thinking, but trying to figure out and try to understand why are they wearing what they are wearing and why are they thinking what they are thinking, right? Without me necessarily agreeing with any of that. Okay. So that's what I do, just generally. Now, how does writing play a role in what I do? We use a lot of writing, and we use it differently in the different stages of research. And I just wanted to highlight for today how we use it for data collection, for data analysis, and when we are finally writing papers or reports or whatever. And I guess I'll just highlight how we write for data collection and how we write for writing reports. So we use a lot of field notes, and these are just my field notes from one of my projects, just jottings. And I very quickly after those jottings, maybe the same day, hopefully the same day, I will turn them into this. So from these jottings, I wrote these 5 pages of field notes. And these field notes are very important primary data that we will use, which means that if I do them wrong, I will have no data, which is bad. So think that you are going abroad for 2 months and you do all these interviews and observations and you take some field notes, and then you come back and you're trying to write your thesis or whatever. And as you are trying to write it, you start realizing that everything that you wrote is not data. That's bad, right? That happened to me the first time when I did a qualitative study. It was before being trained as an anthropologist. I just had the wrong advisors and I didn't really understand or knew what I was doing. So I did all this wonderful stuff and then I didn't have data. And I didn't realize that I didn't have data, so I was trying to do something with the non-data that I had. That was pretty bad. But what I ended up doing was really doing a quantitative study with the other section of information that I collected. But so a couple of things that I like to talk about with my students in anthropology is that when you are writing field notes, you have to differentiate between descriptive field notes, analytical field notes, and methodological field notes. There may be more than that, but at least you have to differentiate between descriptive, analytical, and methodological. And the key here is that you have to have some descriptive field notes, meaning field notes where you are saying what you see without judging. You are not stating your opinion about what you're seeing. You are trying to understand what someone is telling you in an interview instead of trying to write down your opinion of what this person is saying. And that's the essence. That's the data that you will be able to analyze eventually. Then you can also write other analytical field notes, maybe as you are interviewing someone or as you are observing something. You have all these insights that are really how this relates to the theories you are trying to engage with. You can write those field notes too, but you have to separate them. It sounds pretty straightforward, but it is something that we really need to learn how to do. Okay, so from, I'll just go faster here. Well, this is just one example of descriptive, methodological, and analytical field notes. This is something from a test that I have my students do. I just ask them to observe something, and then to try to figure out when are they describing something, and when are they judging or giving their opinion or whatever. And this, at the beginning of the cultural anthropology class that I teach, students really struggle with this. When I show them these pictures that are basically household members with the food that they consume in a week, the initial kind of description that students give me are really opinions about how balanced or unbalanced the diet seems, or other stuff about family dynamics that they are sad or they are whatever. So learning how to differentiate, how to separate between your opinion and what you are observing is something that you just learn how to do. And I feel like I'm in the process of learning, right? Similar example, lots of students got this one wrong. Okay. So we use writing as data collection in the form of field notes. And the key there is to differentiate between describing and your opinions, your analysis, and anything else. Then when you're writing a report, a paper, or basically anything, there are different ways of doing it, but I like to say that the building block is what I call descriptive analytic unit, which is based on these authors here, Emerson, Fritz, and Shaw. And it basically consists on building your paper, your report, based out of these building blocks, and each of the building blocks has 3 sections. Sometimes I even say 3 paragraphs, although that's not necessarily the case, but 3 sections. The first section where you make an analytic point and you give some orienting information to the reader. You're not giving your opinions there, you're not giving the description of what you found in the field. You're just, it is like an introduction to what you are going to say. Then you include an excerpt, which may be a quote from an interview or a combination of field notes and quotes from interviews. And the excerpt can be long or short, but it is basically data. So you give the introduction, then you give the data, and then you give an analytic commentary where you can introduce your opinions, your interpretations. You try to exemplify or expand your analytic point based out of the data that you are providing, that kind of thing. And I feel like mastering this building block is what we try to do when we do ethnographic work and when we try to communicate for whatever purposes that we are writing. It is mastering this. I am preparing a manuscript right now, and I am struggling with that. It has to do with public health in Guatemala. And in my findings, this is really work in progress right now. There is this notion of institutional chaos that I am trying to convey. And I am trying to make an analytical point here. Maybe too long. I need to shorten it a little. Then I have my quote here, which I think really exemplifies what I'm trying to convey. Then I give some other information that comes from my field notes. And then I try to comment on that. And that's what I do. And so if I'm writing a paper for a journal, maybe I will have 2 or 3 of this as part of my paper. If I am writing the technical report for the case, the right to food and nutrition case, it was very long, so it had many of these descriptive analytic units. When I gave simplified versions for discussion at the community level, I gave them this in a very simplified version. So, well, that's what I do. Sometimes the excerpts are really engaging. They tell really, I don't know, awesome stories that people like to read and that people can relate to. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they are just a quote that is kind of, I don't know, even bizarre or something, but that somehow shows what I'm trying to show, right? Yeah, and then I have an example from a book that I like to use in the class that I teach, where they show a very concise descriptive analytic unit. Same thing, the paragraph, the excerpt, the commentary. So in summary, when we do ethnographic work, we assume that we are engaging with highly subjective stuff. There's no way around that. So because of that, we have to be more aware of how all that subjectivity gets recorded as we are collecting data and as we are writing, and how we separate between their subjectivity and my subjectivity, right? And that's it. Thank you.
If you're in one of my classes, keep all of this in mind because you'll be doing an ethnography next, so about cultural relativism and how to not have non-data to work with at the end. And I'd like to thank all of the people on my committee who helped make this event possible. Sarah Hart, Mickey, Amber Engelson, Rob Gilmore, and Blake Sanz. And Blake is going to start our question session, and we hope a lot of you will ask questions. So maybe if the 3 of you could sit here and could we roll this out so you guys can maybe I can just, yeah, maybe.
So I'll open it up to anyone who wants to ask questions. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Yes?
So mine is for Dr. Schulten. You briefly mentioned habeas corpus, so I was curious, what were your findings on habeas corpus and Lincoln during the Civil War?
The question was, what were Dr. Schulten's findings about habeas corpus during World War II?
We should first start with a quiz for the audience. What is the fun lab? What is the writ of habeas corpus? And what does it give you? You should all know this in case you get arrested in the dead of night, which at your age might happen given the state of Colorado's law these days. The writ of habeas corpus is from common law. It literally means to bring the body, to show the body. It is a protection you have that if you are arrested, you must be charged with a crime. This is why the writ of habeas corpus is so much in play with Guantanamo. During the Civil War, Lincoln, and more importantly, the Secretary of State, William Seward, believed that the threat of internal subversion was so great that it warranted the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, meaning that Lincoln and Seward could deputize men across the Union to arrest people without cause, because they believed primarily that they were subverting the draft. It's tricky with Lincoln. This is something that we don't like to talk about because Lincoln holds a certain kind of place as a man who preserved the Union. He believed that the threat was so great that this was a small sacrifice for a much greater protection of liberties. He said, you want to know what keeps me up at night? Slavery keeps me up at night. I worry about the 13th Amendment. I worry about the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't worry about suspending the writ of habeas corpus. historians have looked back and thought, well, was there really an imminent threat of subversion in the Union? I mean, there was a civil war, of course, a massive case of internal subversion. But in the Union itself, in the loyal states, was subversion imminent? Right? Was a coup imminent? And it's hard to make that case. I think in that respect, there was a kind of infringement on civil liberties. To me, what's almost more important is the way that historians and the American reading public has sort of decided that that's less important to us than the preservation of the Union as a whole. Do you see? So yeah, technically he did violate certain civil liberties. On balance, he believed those were necessary in order to win the war and destroy slavery.
Other questions? Yes.
My question is about the research of education. Did you find a certain test was better for maintaining the memory over time? Sorry.
Oh, interesting. You know, I think there is some evidence that however you learned it the first time, like if you learned it studying for a multiple choice test, you would do better on multiple choice tests in the future. If you learned it studying for an essay test, you'd do better on essay tests in the future. Because you're used to that kind of method of recall and regurgitation or reassembly or something like that. Yeah, mine was multiple choice both times, so that was kind of a wash. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Any others? Yes.
This one is for Dr. Schulten as well. She said, sorry, she just used me. You said you didn't really know what to do with the map, but what I noticed in the draft was he chose the colors of what is still the German flag, and he did. So I was just wondering if you had anything to say about that.
Well, this is where I need to do my homework because I will tell you that I barely passed art history way back when. I'm not a good visual person. I have to. That's sort of why I wanted to show this to you, because when I saw these drafts, I felt like, oh God, there's a gold mine here, and I don't know where to begin, right? So there's all kinds of color theory. I think that one could look at, particularly because his training is in design and advertising. So yet another area I need to learn about. But what you just picked up flew right over my head. Do you see? So I think this is where I mean, this is sort of where knowledge production is going, I think. But you hear more and more about the importance of collaborative work. And for me, that what you just said points exactly to. So you
Propaganda, I guess you'd say.
Say it again.
No, sorry. Well, I guess what I was thinking is that instead of propaganda speaking to Americans, like we could all be heard.
That's right. Right. And the way he uses those shocking colors, right? And there's a real persuasive technique. Very good. Thank you.
Others? I've got a quick question. So each of you described some moment of excitement or curiosity about the thing that you study. And I'm curious, I think for a lot of our students, correct me if I'm wrong, students, but you've been asked to find these research questions and then to narrow them probably in some way towards some specific thing that you're interested in. And I can guess that that might be hard or frustrating or difficult to know how to do that. And so I was wondering if the three of you might each comment a little bit on how you went from, oh, cool, these drafts of maps are great, or that's weird, my course evaluations are great, but my students aren't learning stuff, or here's a moment of like, these community leaders are doing a thing that they don't understand that they're doing. That's curious to me. How do you go from that moment of interest to the writing project? I think a lot of students might be stuck somewhere in the middle there.
I don't know. Let's see. I feel like I am just generally, I live life finding all these amazing things going on. So when I'm doing any kind of research, I feel like I'm always finding super interesting things. And what I find a hard time doing is just then deciding, okay, so I have these 25 wonderful, interesting things that I need, that I would like to tell the world about. How do I decide which one or two should I decide? I have to say that I usually work with teams. So we end up making those decisions together. And when we do work that involves community leaders, we somehow include some discussion with the leaders as well to make those decisions. But yeah, I feel like at every moment in the research process, the hardest thing for me is to narrow it down. I always have this wonderful question that I would like to answer through a research project, but then when I start trying to bring that down to earth, I realize that I cannot really address it all. I have to choose, and that's frustrating because then the project is not as awesome as it sounded. So yeah, and I find that's, I feel like my job when I'm advising undergrads getting ready for their thesis or graduate students with their thesis, a lot of my work is helping them narrow down their research in a way that they will not be frustrated in a few months. Yeah.
Well, that was a really great answer. I don't quite know what to add to that. I do find, some of my projects look pretty cut and dry. Collect this data, do these analyses, make a table, you're done. But really they do drift, and it helps a lot to write it out, to write a draft, to write the first few pages. And then you look at your own ideas and realize, that doesn't actually make sense. I've got to go back now, because you said this was true, then that can't be true. Okay, I guess that's true, so I can't collect the data that way. So it really helps to think through it and write it out, and then you end up doing many drafts. And don't be afraid to write many drafts. Just getting the ideas out on paper. Sometimes you can see the inconsistencies if they're on paper. So that helps me a fair amount. And I guess as a student on a quarter system, I'd say just get it done is the other thing. Don't worry about this. Don't be fantasizing about your Nobel Prize for this paper. Just think this is an exercise. I'm getting this done. This is a reasonable topic. Let me just crank through this. Do the best you can, but realize you got a deadline and it's not going to be perfect. But you learn something through the process. I think I heard about dissertations. At least in my field, people were told it's the worst thing you'll ever write, but it gets you a PhD, and you'll write much better things later on. So it might be that your thesis projects or whatever are not the thing you're most proud of, but you learn a lot in the process, and you'll write better things later.
So you probably don't think that historians have dirty laundry because we're too boring for that, but I will tell you the scandal of the month right now in the history profession. Go ahead and Google History Manifesto when you get a chance. Not now, because that would be rude, but when you go back to your work. So late last year, two colleagues of mine, one's the chair at Harvard and one was in Chicago and just went to Brown, they published the History Manifesto, a very tightly argued, very inflammatory, extended essay that essentially argues that historians have given up on the big questions. That their claims, by the way, have been challenged and to some people discredited. But their claim is, over the last half century, historians have retreated from the big questions, the long questions, enormously challenging things about climate change or conflict around the world, that instead we've become more and more narrow and more specialized. You've heard the argument about how hyper-specialized a dissertation can be, for instance. So this isn't the question that you asked is at the heart of the profession. And it's become this little internal feud among historians about, well, have we abandoned big questions? Are we becoming more and more specialized? So this really is a hot topic. So that's my way of alighting the question. For me, though, I'll tell you that this question of how you create a research question has, for me, always been my Achilles heel. And it might be the secret reason that I like maps, because in some ways I start with the maps. So another project that I'm very passionate about right now is that over the last year, I've started to notice and therefore collect images of maps that were made primarily by young girls between the ages of 10 and 18 from about 1800 to 1830. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of these in the archives, because in that period, girls were educated separate from boys, largely what we would call academies or seminaries, and largely what we would now look at as a kind of finishing education. Greek, Latin, rhetoric. I mean, actually it sounds pretty rigorous, doesn't it? Rhetoric, but geography was central to that. And so these girls would make these maps over and over again of the United States. Some were painted, some embroidered, some drawn. They're fantastically beautiful. They are meticulous. I almost thought about showing them to them tonight because it's an open question for me. I have all these. I have a couple hundred now in my database, digital versions. What do they mean? Is there anything there, right? And that, I think, gets to the heart of your question. Something happened. There's this epiphenomenon of girls creating maps of the United States. The question is, are they ways of exercising nationalism when the nation is very fragile? Are they ways of exercising and practicing penmanship, of internalizing geography concepts so that they will stay with them over the course of their long life? My point is, I have a data set, as Alejandro said, and I know a lot about girls' education at the time, but it's still hard for me to know what to make of all these and whether they have historical significance on their own. So that's sort of a live way that I'm dealing with it.
Any other final question? Yes.
Just really quickly, Dr. Bacon, what kind of mistakes did you have in your dissertation, or what do you wish you could have done better? Or looking back, what do you see were some of your slip-ups?
Boy, there was a lot. I mean, we don't have much time left. No, you know, I think I didn't pick a topic with a lot of legs. You know, it's a one paper and done kind of a thing. Like, and especially if you're going to pursue an academic career, it's like, this paper sets me up for the next 20 papers. Or this paper sets me up for, now I've mastered a literature that I could write about for a decade. And instead it was, now I've mastered a literature that I might get one paper out of. Like that's bad. You've got to pick a different literature. In marketing, a little bit different. You want something fairly applied. So a burning question that marketing managers are worried about. Not just something that an academic thinks is kind of interesting, but what's something that marketing managers are concerned about? And mine really wasn't of that great interest. So that meant it would be hard to get funding from business. And so I guess there's lots of things to consider in choosing topics. You know, who would be interested in this? Who might fund this research going forward? How many papers could I get out of this? Is this going to be a long-term pursuit? I probably should have weighed those things more carefully. In fact, the dissertation that I wrote has nothing to do with research I've done.
Any last questions? Yes.
Hi. So all of you have said something along the lines of like how your research can be applied. I was wondering, when you're writing papers, you know, to be published, and obviously it varies from paper to paper, but how do you balance sort of, this is what I've researched, these are my findings, and then that discussion element of like how to move it beyond just, this is interesting. That's something I struggle with.
Alejandro?
Well, I always struggle with that, and because my own, I don't know, so I can see you. You know that I have, in the past I sat in that place, so I wasn't able to see the person. Yeah. So, because my trajectory is really, and my commitment is really in trying to somehow help improve the health system in Guatemala, that only interests to Guatemalans, and not even all Guatemalans, right? So when I'm trying to write something for publication, an academic publication, that's always my struggle, really. I have to figure out, okay, so the reason why I'm doing this is because I think that this can somehow influence the debates in Guatemala. So what is interesting about this that will make it valuable to other people? And that's, to be honest, I mean, I'm on my second year here at the U, so I'm still working, trying to write papers that are based out of my dissertation, trying to somehow use all the literature that I read for my dissertation. But I keep asking me that question, and again, what I feel is very helpful in my case is that all of my work is collaborative in nature. So I'm working with other people, and often they tell me, well, they help me figure that out. something that I strongly believe in is that all this thinking process that is involved in doing research or writing has to involve, I think, at least two things. One is just writing down bringing it from your head to the paper, right? And it doesn't matter how bad or incoherent it is. That is something that you have to do. But then the other thing is you have to somehow talk to people or share what you wrote. So I really believe that it is a collective effort. So if you, I don't know, meet for coffee with one of your friends and you tell her about, well, I have this idea, you will get really good feedback and insights, and maybe you, as you are trying to explain it to her, you will realize, oh, this is it. So I really believe in the writing and then talking to people, having group discussions.
So the question was about writing that discussion section, is that right? I think an important issue is to think about your audience. And I've had the good fortune now to become the editor of the Journal of Marketing Education. So I get to look at papers and say, oh, your discussion isn't good enough, I'm not going to accept it. But usually there, for example, I want to see implications for marketing educators. So you write this cool paper with great graphics and cool math, nice. Okay, what does this mean for someone who teaches marketing for a living? You've got to tell me that in the discussion. You've got to tell me you should have comprehensive exams, you should have exercises that repeat, study, figure out what your audience wants to hear and put that in the discussion section. So maybe that's identifying who your target is if you're writing a paper. Who's intended to read this, and what are the takeaways they're looking for? How could I contribute to that?
For historians, it sort of boils down to the question we ask all of our students, especially our seniors who all write theses. So what? Right? Now, I'll be frank, my work is not alleviating poverty in Guatemala. My so whats are more tenuous, right? Historians talk about how we got to where we are. Right? Why is the University of Denver on this site? Right? I researched that last year for this Esquicentennial. Who was John Evans? Right? Questions like that. Those are not make or break, right? Those aren't going to be headline news stories, but for us, they're much more, they're questions that infuse the very way we see the world around us. So just to give you a concrete example, I'm very proud of one of my seniors who wrote his thesis this year, Hayden Johnson. You may know him. He's a passionate history major, like me, passionate about Lincoln, and really wanted to think particularly about the rise of Lincoln in the 1850s. And that boy delved into the records of the Chicago newspapers in the late 1850s. And when he came up for air, one of the things he began to realize is that the relationship between Lincoln and the press in Chicago and the party apparatus was so tight that it was almost inextricable. That's something that no other historian has written about. Now, that's extraordinary. But part of it was going after, why Lincoln in 1856, 57, 58? Why that guy? He was a loser in politics, right? Had gone home, a loser from his one term in Congress in the late 1840s. So how did that rebirth happen? Hayden wanted to know. And he just drilled down into something very specific, but that actually has, in my view, incredible salience. Talk about the relationship between parties and the media and politicians. Think about that today. So for me, there was a real sort of story about the birth of that modern press communication relationship with politics. So now they're not always that direct in terms of the relevance question, and I would say my answers are going to be more tenuous necessarily than the social scientists because I'm a humanist.
You should take some cookies from the back as you leave. One last round of applause, please. Thank you for coming.